Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy. And our guest today is John Prendergast, who is a psychologist, formerly a professor of psychology. He's also a spiritual teacher who was invited to teach by a couple of people, including Adyashanti, and he's an author. And the most recent book, which we'll be discussing today, is Your Deepest Ground, a guide to embodied spirituality. John is also the author of several other books, though, a beautiful one, The Deep Heart, Our Portal to Presence. Really a beautiful, gentle book. And also of the book In Touch, How to Tune In to the Inner Guidance of Your Body and Trust Yourself. And a series, Sacred Mirror, Non-Dual Wisdom and Psychotherapy. But today, we'll zero in on the topic of John's latest book, Your Deepest Ground. And so, John, welcome. And perhaps we can start with the obvious question. What is our ground, our deepest ground?
What is our deepest ground? Well, when I write about and talk about the ground, I use it in two ways. One as a metaphor for a felt sense of aliveness and stability, spacious, alive stability that we feel in the lower part of our body, in the belly, in the hips, and the legs. So where this really comes online and we feel ourselves really fully inhabiting the body. So that's the subjective sense of ground, and it's palpable, it's visceral. We feel as that ground in the body opens, we feel like we're really landing here, and in a very expansive and open way. So that's the subjective sense. And then I also use it as a metaphor for being in touch with reality. And there are different levels to that. There's a physical level, just being in touch with our body. There's a mental level of just having a clear capacity for clear thought, an emotional clarity or groundedness, being in touch with our feelings, subtle energies, being in touch with those within our body and interpersonally as well. And then the deepest ground, which is ungraspable, unfathomable, and which is referred to with many names, as the radiant void, as Buddha nature, as Christ consciousness, something that is without quality, and yet we know it, can know it intimately as a ground of awareness. It has a quality of open, unbounded openness to it.
But touching into this nothingness, it's like changes everything.
It does. It absolutely does, because we generally take ourselves as a fragment, as a contracted, separate being. And when the bottom falls out and the walls come off and the roof comes off, and we know ourselves as this empty openness, as no thingness, it provides a completely different context for how we experience ourself and how we experience the world and how we move from a very different place, a place of love, a place of deep peace, groundedness. So yeah, when I talk about your deepest ground, this is what I'm referring to.
John, could I ask you, getting on the subject of ground, you also talk a lot about in your book about presence. And can you distinguish a presence from ground?
Yes and no. So the yes is the ground is I would say, an aspect of presence. In my experience working, in my own experience with myself and people that I've worked with for 4 decades now, there are 3 major portals to presence. One is through the mind, one is through the heart, one is through the ground. It's all opening to the same non-thingness, open, radiant presence, but they have different flavors. So the opening of the mind brings a sense of tremendous spaciousness and clarity. The openness of the heart, tremendous love, compassion, sense of wholeness and non-separation. Openness of the ground gives a sense of tremendous solidity. And so these are all, we could say, essential aspects of presence. And what's interesting is when we open to the ground, initially it feels like a descent, like the bottom opens up. But as it continues to open, it becomes global. And the same is true for the heart. You know, at first it feels like it's centered here, mid-chest and back, and then also global. And similarly with the mind. So it's like they're different doors. They have different qualities or essential qualities of being. And yet they all are aspects of awake awareness. And so when I speak of presence, I'm speaking of awake awareness and these different portals to it.
Yeah. And John, you make a really very strong statement, which struck me so much that I copied it out. So you said that in over 40 years of work with students and clients, and you've been both a spiritual teacher and a psychotherapist, you say in over 40 years of work with students and clients, the presence or absence of ground has been the most important theme. That's quite a statement.
It is. And reason being, I should back up a little bit, just to say for unknown reasons, I am particularly sensitive to subtle somatic dimensions of the body. And so sitting with people who are interested in really a deep transformational process of healing and awakening, what I've discovered is very often in that process of awakening and opening, people encounter a deep fear of letting go.
Yes.
A fear of losing control. And that
annihilation, you also said.
Annihilation, it's a fear of annihilation. It's like if we lose control, if I lose control, I'll die. I'll be annihilated. I'll lose who I am. And that whole system, that part of the system tends to localize in the guts, in the solar plexus, the lower belly, and the base of the spine, in the chakra system, three lower chakras. And so again and again in my work with people, as they're in the process of healing and awakening, they encounter this fear of losing control and of annihilation. And very often this is not fully conscious. Often it's subconscious. And there are many dimensions to that. And so this is what I'm referring to in my work over 4 decades, people, this in-depth work. And often people are not initially aware of it. So when we sit with it and people begin to open and then they find their process becoming in some way inhibited, and as we explore more deeply, they come into these contractions, areas of contraction in the lower body that are associated with this fear of letting go, of losing control, and of annihilation.
But ultimately, on the spiritual journey, this life or next or whenever, that's something that happens.
It is, yeah. It's if we're really interested in embodying our essential nature, we have to move and move through these layers of resistance, unconscious resistance, because it's not enough. This up and out transcendence is a beautiful first step, I would say. But really, there's a very important process of embodying awareness more and more deeply in the physical body, in the subtle body. And this is, I think, very important as an integral approach to spirituality.
Nicely said. And you, it seems like there have been 2 quite different perspectives on spiritual life. One is a kind of up and out, let's get the hell out of here, this place sucks. Well, there's no intelligent life here, Scotty, beam me up, or whatever it is.
Beam me up, that's right.
And the other is, yes, a moving through the psychological and spiritual limitations to a transcendent opening, but then a phase of full embodiment. And you use the story of the myth of the underground descent, and which is very closely related to the hero's journey as defined by Joseph Campbell, and the phase of Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, who said that distinguishing feature of the lives of those people who'd contributed most to humankind was that they went through a cycle of withdrawal and return. They withdrew from society and conventional life to some deeper inner exploration, had some kind of realization, and then returned to offer the benefits. And it sounds like
Exactly.
that's what you're describing.
It is. I mean, there are, I think what I'm describing has some of those elements of a necessary descent into the unconscious, which corresponds with these kind of lower energetic centers. But maybe unlike the hero's myth or story, it's not like we come back with, the chalice or the golden fleece, or we don't emerge as a recognizable hero to society. I think much truer is that we emerge much more simple, much more humbly, much more kind of stripped and open and available to life. And so it's, in a way, the hero gets lost. The heroic will, the egoic will gets lost in the process, in this deep descent. And Carl Jung is also articulating this descent as well, and something that he experienced in a very tumultuous way over a century ago on the eve of World War I. So that was interesting to kind of revisit Jung as I was exploring this question of the multidimensionality of the ground, because there is this archetypal dimension. And of course, this is what Joseph Campbell was pointing to.
John, you also mentioned, and I'm a Tolkien fan, and I like stories. And you mentioned Gandalf going into the underworld and wrestling with Belrog. I think that's
exactly
this huge creature, and he falls, descent, down into the abyss. And then he comes out later and he's transformed. It's like he doesn't even quite know himself as Gandalf. And the people don't quite recognize him. And in the story of Jesus, which I think Tolkien was riffing off because he was about Catholic. I mean, he knew that story. Jesus dies and descends into the lower parts of the world, wherever that is. And then he comes back. And in the beginning, his disciples don't even recognize him.
That's right.
Thomas says, I want to stick hands in the wound to make sure it's really you. Who are you? So there's this transformation to a kind of a new self that in the beginning we don't know ourselves, and those around us don't quite know how to explain it either. So have you found that in your work with your students and yourself?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, what happens is our ordinary sense of identity is deeply questioned and seen through. So it's beautiful to bring up that particular teaching, like Christ or Jesus descended into hell, and then rose from that. And that's right. Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and so he was developing that theme. And we see it in Dante's Inferno with that descent to Kor, and the encounter with the king devil, and the descent into another realm, passing through that to Purgatorio, and then an ascent as well. So it's a very, very deep mythological process that we hear about. And I think those images that we see, whether it's Gandalf, not quite knowing himself and not quite recognized, or Jesus, is referring to a kind of translucency of the body-mind that emerges. And that we can also refer to as a kind of core illumination. So in the very core of the body, there is this luminosity, generally unconscious. And as people begin to awaken, particularly in this descent of awareness and emergence of the sense of the spirit in everything, the immanence of spirit, there is a sense of the interior of the body lighting up. And so what we took to be dense and solid actually just reveals itself as much more translucent, much more luminous. And these are the themes that we see articulated in these different traditions, this kind of inherent dormant luminosity that emerges as there's growing intimacy with essential nature, an embodied sense of essential nature. And I have felt that in myself. I mean, this whole description of the opening of the ground was really unfamiliar territory until probably, I mean, there were hints of it, but it really wasn't until maybe 20, 25 years ago that it started to come online. Maybe, no, as I say that, that's not quite right. I can see earlier evidence of that, but it really gained force in the last 20 years, both in terms of my own experience and as I could sense this kind of interior luminosity as there was a process of healing and awakening. I could also sense it in others, often before they did. But when I would point to it, they could recognize it as well.
You also mentioned in what I've read about your life story that you spend a lot of time in wilderness, both backpacking into wilderness with others and by yourself. And has that been a part of this process that you've been going through?
Not so much. I mean, I think it's, I love the high country. I'm just, you know, I love the high Sierra, and mostly I go with others, you know, with friends and just occasionally solo. But when I do, you know, when I do go to the high country, in that silence, in that stillness, in that remarkable beauty, the luminosity, this is really called, you know, into the foreground of experience. But no, it hasn't been so much time in nature that's been facilitative as it has been a long-standing meditation practice and practice of self-inquiry and time with authentic teachers. I really needed the help of attuned guides to help me see through the obscurations and places of fixation. So both practice, my own meditative practice and self-inquiry practice, but also my time spent with authentic teachers has been the primary, on a retreat, has been, I would say, the primary facilitative factor.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Adyashanti was one of your primary teachers, and what a remarkable man. I think he's retired from teaching now,
Yeah, he
but
did.
I've had a couple of experiences with him, and I don't trust spiritual teachers for a lot of personal reasons. And I used to say, when somebody says they're a spiritual teacher, I grab my pants and grab my wallet and get out of the room, right? But I certainly felt that this is a good guy. This man knows where if he speaks, and I immediately felt openness and trust to him. A really remarkable.
Yeah, very high integrity, very authentic. And I felt the same thing. I went to hear, I worked with Jean Klein for probably, excuse me, over 15 years, and then he passed away. And a friend invited me to come to a talk of Adyashanti, and I immediately felt the same presence and resonance. I had to go through a letting go of my loyalty in a way to working with Jean Klein in order to be open to Adya. That was an interesting process, but it seemed like he just took over, you know, where Jean had left off, and was, I mean, it's a mysterious thing, the connection with a teacher. It's very individual. It's very a matter of resonance and intuition. But I felt that immediate connection and recognition of Adya as my next teacher, and he was extremely helpful in this process of opening for me. And we've stayed in touch and been friends. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. John, I want to go back and just touch into something you said before, which I had not heard before, and that was I had brought in the Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and the return of the hero, and you spoke of the hero in a way I hadn't heard of before, which I thought was very striking and important. That maybe in some of the deeper inner journeys, the heroic will is released, and one comes back not as a in quotation marks hero anyway, perhaps not even recognizable, as with the 10 ox herding picture where the sage is unrecognized, but perhaps in a very simple way, stripped of a lot of the baggage that or even psychological dynamisms that brought us onto the path.
Yeah, I think so. And the ox herding pictures, I think, are is an interesting and important metaphor because, there is a returning to the world, so to speak, but in a very simplified way. And it's difficult to actually grasp, I would say, that is to say, to define um, who one is. And there's not interest in doing that, which is, I think that's the most important thing. It's like, I don't need to know who I am as a story or as an image. And it's more of a sense of just opening to life and listening and following moment to moment. So it doesn't have a heroic accomplishment. It's in a certain way, it's not an accomplishment or an achievement or an attainment, which is how we normally think about achieving a goal, because all of that just like dissolves. And there's a recognition, what I have been looking for, I am, and so is, and as is everyone else. And so there's no hierarchy. There's no sense of I'm better than, or that I've accomplished anything. But that whole kind of seeking mechanism falls away, and there's a simplicity and an openness. So in that sense, it's a bit different than our normal understanding of the hero or heroine's journey.
Yeah, yes, and I have to say I love this book, John. Your Deepest Ground is really a very beautiful, heartful, um, yeah, truly authentic work. And I copied out various quotes to read at various places or to pose to you. But since you're bringing in this idea of the person who returns from the quest as a simpler, as in some ways very unpretentious, shall we say. You point out that it's very easy to have idealized view of saints and sages. And you give some wise caution about idealizing them and assuming that we can become those ideals.
Yeah, well, I think there's a tyranny of idealization that many people on the spiritual path, myself included, got caught in. You read the books about, I came through the Indian tradition. So when I first read, I was an undergraduate at the University of California, and someone gave me Yogananda's autobiography. And I read that, and it's like, wow, how remarkable, all these special qualities and higher states of consciousness. So that was kind of my model. It's like higher states and, these saints and I have to confess, I had an early ambition to be a saint.
Well, that's not all bad, but one of the things I took away from that book, I was very moved by it also, was the deep humility
Yeah.
of this man. It's like, again, somebody who's been touched by grace or been gifted something, so not taking a lot of personal credit for it.
Well, that's what it is. It's like you can't hold on to any of it because it actually doesn't belong or refer to you. And who we are, what we discover in this process of opening, of inquiry, is we're not who we think we are. And we can't, with our mind, define who or what we are. But there is an intuitive recognition. There's a sense of being at ease, at home, of being discovering a deep sense of peace, and also knowing this is true for everyone, right? That this doesn't make one special. It releases us from the desire to be special or the need to be special. It's a real homecoming, and there's a naturalness to it. As we're using the word unpretentious. It's like I don't have to pretend to be someone or something. I can simply be as I am. And being as I am means I'm also a conditioned being. I have flaws, I have limitations, I am learning, I am growing, as an individual. And to recognize our true nature which is unconditioned and open and boundless, actually gives space for us to be simple and natural and human. Releases us from the ideal of who we think we should be and allows us to just simply be as we are. And that actually gives space not only for our kind of ordinary humanity and our conditioning, but for deeper elements that are essential, like our gifts, let's say, to come out and be shared in a way that feels appropriate and natural.
Mm.
Yeah, there's an old, I think it's a Protestant poem, or it was a hymn, but the line stuck with me. It says, ready to go, ready to stay, ready my place to fill, ready for service small or great, ready to do God's will.
Beautiful.
So whatever you're called to do, true humility and that sense of this is not about me has to be,
That's it.
what we follow.
That's it. And it's very quiet. There's no, like, one of the interesting things, and this is something I've been, in my first book, In Touch, I was looking at is, getting in touch with a sense of inner guidance. And the guidance is very quiet. It's non-assertive, it's non-insistent, it's non-judgmental. It's not, you need to do God's work in this way, or I'm on a mission. It doesn't have that kind of missionary zeal or a sense of inflation at all. And it's really very quiet, and it requires a quietude, a silence, a willingness to let go of who we think we are and what this world is. And then it's interesting, the willfulness kind of gradually transforms into a willingness, that this...
That's nice. Yeah, thank you.
A very beautiful, this hymn, John, that you recited, points to. It's like, I think we see this, it's, there's a sense of surrender. Thy will be done. And Meister Eckhart pointed to this as well. If we have one prayer, let it be, thy will be done.
John, your description of this quiet guidance reminded me of the Quaker statement about the still small voice within. Does that?
Very much so. Very, very much so.
So part of this presence, part of this grounding also includes a sense of a personal guidance and direction, how we as an individual, something that's connected to everything, moves through this time that we are given. And I find great comfort in that, but sometimes I really struggle, and I've had periods of time when it's been very clear what I should do.
Yeah, it's we could speak of it as personal guidance, or maybe I prefer the word individual guidance, because because it doesn't have a personal feeling so much to it. It can initially, and then you realize, oh, it's not really personal. There's something greater moving through that I'm listening to. And as to the small, still voice, that's one channel that it can come through, in terms of the audio channel, but also, and occasionally it comes that way through me, but fairly rarely. Much more it's kinesthetic or proprioceptive, as a felt sense, as a subtle kind of inclination or movement for the next obvious step. And what I found is I don't need to know more than that. I don't need to know the final destination, because I can't. I don't know, I can't know, I don't need to know. It's really like, what is the next step? And in that quietude of that listening, very often there's a kind of inclination in a particular direction. And so that, for me, is a form that it takes in terms of guidance.
And John, the thrust of your book, Your Deepest Ground, is this opening to, well, to our deepest ground.
Our groundless ground.
Our groundless ground, yes. Well, we'll get to that. And you provide some beautiful inquiries for that process. Are there specific practices for this, or is this more an opening that occurs as a function of inner work in general?
It can be both. I think it can be facilitated by practice, by attending in a particular way, and it also unfolds spontaneously. So in that sense, it can be both. I think there is that tendency, there is a natural tendency of awareness to open and then descend, although it can open in very different ways for people. Different portals can open in different orders, but generally speaking, it will include this descending aspect. What was your question again, Roger?
Well, I was wondering
about practice, right?
Yeah, practice.
Yeah.
In general, I tend to think as we talk about cultivating particular qualities or aspects of being, that there are often any inner work, anything which thins the barriers and blocks and which opens us in various ways is facilitating for the cultivation of any capacity or virtue. But then sometimes there are very specific practices, for example, loving kindness to cultivate love. So I'm wondering, does that also apply for opening to our ground?
It can. And two things that come to me is in the way that I work with people, because people who are really spiritual explorers, people who are really interested in discovering their essential nature, and always will encounter blocks and obstacles and fixations. And the question is to recognize them and how to be with them. And if you try to work with them from the level of the mind or the conditioned mind, often progress is very slow and partial. And so what I have found in my work with people is it's really helpful to evoke presence to whatever degree it's accessible. And so let's say I'm working with someone and they start getting in touch with this fear of losing control and the fear of annihilation. Rather than saying, let's go into that, I'll say, just notice that, notice the effect, and let's take a step back first and resource yourself. Like take a few deep breaths, let your attention drop down and in, and feel a sense of spacious awareness behind you. It's an open, boundless sense of awake awareness. And just relax back. We're not trying to grasp it, we're not trying to create it. It's already here. It's just a matter of attuning and resting back. And just take a minute and rest back in and as this open awareness. And so we'll sit, just quietly for a minute or two. And then, someone will say, okay, I have a sense of that, some sense. Then from this more open awareness, we invite the contraction. Invite the constriction, we invite the fear, whatever our experience is, we invite that in to this welcoming open awareness without an agenda to fix or change. Not to make it different, but actually to be intimate with it. This is a fundamental practice that I share with people, and just notice what happens as you welcome this conditioned response of fear and whatever beliefs that may go with it into awareness. And very often, just in that process of welcoming, there's a natural unfolding that begins to happen. Because I think these areas of constriction are also portals to our true nature. And given the chance, they will open and reveal, essential qualities of being and true nature. It's a fascinating process to support and bear witness to. So that's one basic practice, is like welcoming our experience. And in this case, fear of annihilation or fear of losing control.
I just want to emphasize some of the points you made there, John, because they're really striking, and they're counter to common ways of doing psychotherapy, of working with people. First off, you don't go straight into the issue or the block or the barrier. you just take time to settle into presence, awareness,
Mhm.
to resource the person you say. Second, you invite or welcome the block or barrier in, and without an agenda.
Mhm.
And what you're making me realize is, first number of times I've worked with people and failed to do that, that it's been more, okay, let's go in, what exactly is this, to explore, investigate, and of course that has its
It does.
value.
It does.
But there's added value from the taking time to settle and rest in presence, and then to welcome, because what I noticed as you said that, it just feels like it removes the even very subtle tendency to, this is wrong, we got to get rid of it.
Exactly. Which always engenders resistance.
Yes.
Also, John, and one of you, taken directly from your book, you say, maybe there's a paraphrase, but ultimately we find when we do this work, when we open to it, we go to the constrictions, we go into the darkness, we accept the possibility of annihilation, see that we find that the fear is unfounded, that we are the love we seek.
Yeah.
That's a heaven of a statement. That's a very, very powerful idea.
Yeah.
It's based on direct experience, that as we welcome that which we have avoided and pushed away as an inhibition or as a block, we actually discover what it's made up out of is the same thing, right? It's really innocent confusion. It's contraction. And what's in the very center of a contraction? Openness, space,
Mm.
and luminosity. So it is a different approach, and it's one I actually had to correct within myself in terms of my training as a therapist. Okay, let's find out what the problem is and go into it. To actually let's identify what that is, and then step back, open up, and welcome into that. And it makes a huge difference, because we're, as you're suggesting, Roger, we're not trying to, we're not trying to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And that's a very different, that creates a very different atmosphere. It's really pure exploration and just a desire to get to know it better. An ordinary mind can't do that.
Yeah. And that's so important. And I think, in my experience anyway, so underemphasized in conventional psychotherapy. And I know I have a little sadness in myself. I spent a lot of years teaching psychotherapy. Now, maybe I feel maybe I didn't emphasize that enough, and probably wasn't aware of it enough. So,
Well, that's why. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And I'm also struck by the correspondence, an alignment between what you're saying and the central practice of the diamond approach of that Hamid Ali offers, of inquiry. And we have the privilege of doing a year-long series with Hamid, otherwise known as A.H. Almas. And it's been really striking in his approach how much he emphasizes opening to whatever arises out of a curiosity, welcoming, just as you do, and no attachment or intention to change things, but rather to trust the unfolding.
Same principle, isn't it? And I came to this approach from a different angle than Hamid. It's not because I, had studied Hamid. I appreciate Hamid's work very much, and have followed it for years. But it was actually through my work with Jean Klein and his approach of welcoming experience that, and my time with him, that really facilitated this approach. So yeah, it's really remarkable to approach our experience with this kind of innocence and curiosity and affectionate attention, because that's exactly what it's wanting, right? That's
Yeah,
exactly what it's wanting, because we don't, we much prefer, if we're in a conversation with someone, we much prefer that quality of just being received and listened to without an agenda to change us. And
yeah,
same thing applies to our inner experience. So there's another, I just want to mark here, there is another practice of meditative inquiry, which does relate to what we're talking about here. Like there's a welcoming experience as it is, a sensing, a breathing, an innocent curiosity. And there's a specific form of meditative inquiry that has emerged in my work with people that specifically is focused towards beliefs. Because I have found that with these contractions and fixations of attention, very often, not always, it depends on developmentally when they were created, there is a core limiting belief.
Yes.
It could be psychological, it could be existential. Like as the psychological can be often something's really wrong with me, I'm flawed, I'm not enough, something's lacking, I'm screwed up, I'm deficient in some way. Or more existentially, I'm separate, I'm alienated, the universe is hostile.
Mm.
And these are very deep, have very profound effects in terms of our sense of self. And so being able to recognize those first, and they can be usually identified in very simple words because they're often formed in childhood. Noticing what the somatic contraction is and the emotional, the affective reaction is important. And then I find if I, again, kind of step back, let that go, and just evoke the question, what's my deepest knowing about this now? Or alternatively, what's true? And let it go. It's very interesting what happens because there's this infusion of the light of awareness into these areas of contraction. It feels like there's like new information, new energy entering into a closed system, and a very interesting transformative process has. So I think like Hamid, I have found meditative inquiry, even more than sitting practice, to be the most powerful transformative practice in my work.
And Hamid says, going along with what you're saying, one of the essential parts of that is a deep and profound love of the truth.
Absolutely. This is the core of it. It's like it's not so much the practice itself, but where the practice comes from. And if we're engaged in self-inquiry, it's like the first question to ask is, do I really want to know what's true?
Mm.
And to be honest about that, not as a judgment, but just kind of notice what comes up. Do I really want to know? And usually there'll be an ambivalent response. There'll be a yes and a no. And that no is very interesting, right? That no is very, very interesting to be honest about and to welcome that. That can be a starting point. No, I don't want to know. Oh, okay. Welcome in. What's that about? Right.
And John, you're pointing to something which I hadn't heard articulated before, at least that I can recall, which is the implication that at deep levels of work, limiting beliefs, and I also want to just take a moment to acknowledge and emphasize what you're saying about the importance of recognizing limiting beliefs, and that they do tend to underlie, it seems, so many of our blocks and barriers and limitations and act as self-fulfilling prophecies. But you're suggesting that it's important to do what we call, let's see, I'm trying to come up with a term, transpersonal cognitive therapy to work on not just personal limiting beliefs, but existential limiting beliefs. It's almost like there's a very great value in correcting one's metaphysical assumptions about oneself
Roger,
and life.
can you give us an example of an existential limiting belief that you're talking about?
I am a separate self.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I am disconnected from the whole of life.
Yeah.
This goes very, very deep, and it's developmentally inevitable. It's like it's just part of the human experience to take oneself as separate to a certain point, and then we begin to question it, right? And when we start questioning that one, things really open up.
The only other place I can think of this where this has been spoken of explicitly, and of course I'm sure there are other examples and people and teachers, but is in the work of Stanislav Grof, who was the great psychedelic pioneer and transpersonal psychology founder and so forth. And he said, his work with, and he's probably, interestingly, he's probably seen a wider array of profound human experiences than anyone else in history. He personally guided over 1,000 LSD sessions, plus thousands of holotropic breathwork sessions. And he said, for the deepest levels of work, it's really important to, where he stated, I think, was to have a skillful metaphysical framework, which I would understand as saying a framework that has released the kind of limiting existential beliefs to which you're pointing.
Exactly. The more comfortable we are with not knowing, right? Not in terms of being ignorant, of course, but and not in any way devaluing rational thought, but just seeing the limitation of thought.
Yeah.
Right. Seeing that thought, a beautiful, powerful tool, cannot grasp its source. The more that we recognize that, there's kind of a space around ordinary mind that emerges of just openness, of curiosity, of not knowing and not needing to grasp some kind of final conclusion about what reality is. And that quality of openness is so precious and so inherently transformative.
Yes, and it seems that there's even a place there for recognizing limiting beliefs, such as it's not okay not to know.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. And in that openness, a different kind of knowing starts moving, right? Transrational knowing, or a true gnosis emerges.
And how would you, what's the experience of that kind of knowing, John?
For me, because I'm wired more kinesthetically, it comes as a felt sense, almost vibratory, of openness, of aliveness, of luminosity, of some sense of, yeah, those would be the qualities, I would say: aliveness, luminosity, sense of internal clarity about whatever, life, myself.
And so when you say not knowing, it sounds like you're pointing to a couple of things. You're pointing to the importance of recognizing bottomless mystery, and you're also pointing to the importance of a kind of knowing which is not a conceptual understanding.
Exactly. And this is, I didn't know this clearly for many, many years. I couldn't have made that differentiation. I could have done it intellectually quite easily, and did. You read about it, you talk about it. But when there was a real shift that happened, and there was this recognition of inherent wholeness and awake awareness that's always been here in the background. And when it suddenly came into the foreground, the distinction between ordinary thought and this knowing as awake awareness was very, very clear, and eventually, became the ordinary experience as well, within which the mind is operating. So, often it's spoken of as being sky-like, in its expanse and its clarity. And it's a good metaphor.
Beautiful.
Well, here I am, John Dupuy again, and I'm here to talk about supporting the Deep Transformation podcast. The podcast has been an amazing experience for Roger and myself and for our team, and it's been growing. We're currently in the top 2% of worldwide podcasts, which is really remarkable. We think it's very important. We think deep transformation is the only way to go, because if we don't, we're in serious trouble. And we're so grateful for the amazing presences and spirits and soul and people who've been on our podcasts. We'd also like to ask you again for your support, financial support, and thank you for all of you who have been supporting this. And up till now, it's all been out of pocket for Roger and myself. And it takes money to produce, to pay our staff, and for marketing. And so the circle keeps on growing, but the quicker that could happen, the more positive effect we could have in the world. And that's what we're here to do. And I was thinking before this, upstairs in my meditation room, I have the famous 10 Zen ox herding pictures up there. And the final one, after you guys go through all this journey, is going back into the marketplace with open hands and open heart. And so that's what we're trying: open hands, open heart, open mind, so that we can do what? We can transform effectively and deeply, and listen to some of the greatest minds on our planet as to how to do that. So thank you for your support. We love you, and you matter. God bless.
John, I'd love to move into another topic here, and that is one of your chapters in your book, Your Deepest Ground, where you take as exemplars of two kinds of approaches to the psyche and our depths. And you take the exemplars of Carl Jung and Ramana Maharshi, two giants of, what should we call them, explorations of the most profound aspects of the psyche. So maybe you could say, and you juxtapose them in a very beautiful and skillful way. So maybe you could say what these two giants represent for you or symbolize.
Well, this is interesting because just to preface my remarks, when I was approaching this book, and I write about this in the chapter, I was just starting to write the book about the deepest ground, something that's so dear to my heart. And I began to write the first chapter, and the inner voice said, stop. And it's like, oh, all right, I'll stop. And why is that? You know, what do I need? You know, what's happening? And it's like the guidance was the kind of inner knowing, you need to understand the archetypal dimension better. You have a good feel for the personal, the egoic, you have a good feel for the groundless ground, but this archetypal, you need to understand better if you're going to speak about the multidimensional ground, because there are these dimensions. And to be authentic, you need to know this better, you know, not just cognitively, but experientially. And you need to go back to Jung. So that was the inner guidance here. So I went back and I read his, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and which had made such an impact on me when I was a graduate student. Very inspiring, felt very authentic. And then I read his Red Book, which was pretty hard to decipher, pretty dense and obscure, but interesting. And I realized I need to research this more. And so I read other authors about the Red Book and was able to actually to decode his language and get a feel for his journey, his remarkable opening, pioneering opening after he broke from Freud and opened to this deeper dimension. So there was this whole reacquaintance with Jung himself, his process and his discoveries, that at the same time felt like it was very important to be in touch with within myself, this archetypal dimension, to have not just an understanding of it and occasional experiences, but a visceral sense or feel. And the visceral sense of it, and this is true for Jung, is he just let himself drop. You know, this is like a critical point in his experience that I write about. He just made the decision to just let go and allow a natural descent to happen. And he found himself like just falling deep underground. And then this whole kind of world appearing that he began to dialogue with, very tumultuous, one, overwhelming. And he doubted his own sanity, as you know, as a
And
young.
that lasted for several years, didn't it? That was really an extended period.
It went on for many years, and even now some people said this was his psychotic period, but that's not accurate at all. It was certainly challenging, and he questioned his own sanity, but it was a very profound and tumultuous process that went on from kind of 1915 until the late 1920s, I would say. So quite an intense period, and he took notes, which became the Black Book, and into the Black Book, the Red Book, and anyway, so that was my journey with Jung, was just to kind of acquaint myself better with this whole felt sense of this archetypal realm. And what's interesting is my own kind of spiritual roots come more from Advaita Vedanta and Kashmiri Shaivism. And so I encountered the teachings of Ramana Maharshi very early on in my own exploration, although his self-inquiry process was quite a mystery to me when I first read about who am I. I tried to answer with my mind and got nowhere. But he's been one of my teachers, I would say, and I did visit his ashram in India. And speaking of kind of sacred places, the cave in which he sat and the old darshan hall, where he would sit with people for years, is just charged with presence, really holy, sacred space. So anyway, what was interesting to me is that Jung had a chance to meet Ramana and be with him when he went to India in 1936, 37. And he chose not to because he thought he knew who Ramana was. He's like all the other gurus, and he's just interested in pure, stainless Brahman consciousness. And he was, and Jung felt that this was imbalanced, that this would be destructive, actually, of the body and of the ego in a negative way. And so he really was on a different path. And as I write, he had his own dharma. He believed that what Western society needed was had become hyper-rational, was to balance out that hyper-rationalism and include this missing part of the polarity in the psyche, and to have through the Holy Spirit, to have a kind of Christification of humanity. So they had very different approaches, and it was just interesting to see that juxtaposition. And also to see in both traditions, there's a tendency to devalue the other. So in the tradition of Advaita, there'll be a tendency not to deal with the soulful levels and archetypal levels that Jung pioneered so beautifully and so deeply, and to dismiss that as unimportant or even an egoic expression. And from the Jungian side, it's like to give oneself to the transcendent, to the groundless ground, would be in some way subverting or diminishing the individuation process, where there was a balancing of egoic and archetypal levels and continual kind of expansion vertically and horizontally of those two. My experience working with people is they're both important. And,
Yes.
and as we sit and go deeply into our experience, there's a very natural movement of attention between different dimensions. And sometimes, and certainly if we're on vision quests or do plant medicine, these, the archetypal dimensions tend to get evoked more directly, and they can be profoundly healing and revelatory and important and life-changing, deeply transformative. Similarly, there can be movements where the ground falls open, and the walls fall off and the roof falls off, and we feel ourselves as boundless awareness, not separate from anything and intrinsic to everything, which is profoundly liberating and life-giving. And attention will move, and sometimes it'll go to levels of personal conditioning, these core limiting beliefs or contractions and traumatic experience. So attention, given the chance, attention will go to where it needs in the healing and awakening process. And I think it's important to understand that's a unique process for everyone. It's a very spontaneous process, and it's very important to honor that in people that we're working with and within our own self, to not cut ourselves off from any dimension of our experience.
And I want to just emphasize an implication of what you're saying there, John, and that is what for me was one of the most important recognitions of psychotherapy was that we can actually trust our own psyches, that there's a wisdom and guidance there that's much greater than this little ego. And I had spent my entire life, like it seems like most of this people, distrusting my own mind and thinking I had to be on guard against my own impulses and this and that and the other, etc. And it was such a relief to find that actually one can trust my mind and therefore trust oneself.
Exactly. Beautiful point. There is, given a chance, the psyche will unfold itself and reveal either essential qualities of being or being itself. And it's a natural unfolding process, but it needs support and it needs understanding for that to happen. And that's why sometimes that flowering will happen of its own spontaneously at times. And sometimes it's really helpful to have an attuned guide or some kind of supportive environment to facilitate that opening. But yes, there is an intrinsic movement and natural intelligence within each of us.
Yeah.
And stepping back, I love your talking about Ramana Maharshi and Carl Jung and how they were both kind of arrive at the same places, but Jung came from a new, psychotherapy, a student of Freud, and took that and took the individuation, the individuality, which eventually led to the place that I think Ramana Maharshi was starting out at, basically. And it's really interesting. It's kind of a Western and Eastern way of looking at it, but they seem at the deepest levels come to the same transcendent place, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I see it a little differently.
Okay.
Because I think they actually they speak to different dimensions of experience, of depth experience. So to use a metaphor of the ocean, let's say, Jung was exploring the deepest currents within the ocean. The very fine levels of manifestation, the archetypes that would emerge that were not personal, they were transpersonal, and they were cross-cultural. On the other hand, Ramana was interested in the ocean floor, like the ground of being, if you will, the formless awareness. So Jung interested in very subtle form, and Ramana interested in the formless, and each specialized in these areas, but did not necessarily fully address the other. And so I see them as complementary and as close, but actually distinctive.
Have you been able to weave those together a little in your journey? And
Yeah.
if you'd like to speak on that a bit.
Well, that's a big question. Yeah, I as I suggested in the book, there's a kind of a natural unfolding of those, and even let's take the example, because I have found at different times of my life, my attention has gone more to one level or to another. But even the impulse to write this book, for instance, feels like it's coming from some other level. Like I don't have a personal agenda here. I don't have a need personally to write this in order to achieve or demonstrate anything. It's like, it feels like life is saying, share what you've learned. It will be of benefit to others. And once you've shared it, let it go, right? So that has a kind of archetypal feel to it. In other words, I have certain sensitivities, certain insights, certain understandings that I have found to be of help to others. And it feels like it would be actually selfish to simply keep those to myself. And so the movement is a natural sharing of that. All of that within a context of all is well no matter what.
Yeah.
And they're both operating. It's like if this book were never to happen, that would be okay. And there's a natural movement to do so. So if I have the capacity, if I have the time and then to allow that gift to be shared. So that gives an example.
It seems that gets into Jung and the archetypes, and in that spacious emptiness of just unitive experience, there's times when we put on the coat of the archetype, like
Yes.
it's time to stand up as a Gandalf or a wizard or a healer or a holy man or a warrior or a hero. There's times to take on that, but it's held lightly.
That's it. It's held lightly.
So
Yeah,
like,
we don't take that as who we are fundamentally. It's a role function,
yeah.
that life is asking of us to be a parent, for instance, to be a mother, to be a caretaker, to be an artist, to be a lover, it's called forth from circumstances. So it's being open to that, not insisting on it, but not refusing it, and being willing to put on the cloak and then be willing to let it go when it's no longer needed. And there's a lightness of being in that, to not take oneself,
And it connects
take
us to our
oneself.
ancestors. These coats that we put on at certain times is something that's been built over human history. And so there's a connectedness to that layer of it.
Well,
And
this is one of the interesting. We could talk about this quite a bit. It's a fascinating subject. Jung referred to the collective unconscious as a land of the dead. So clearly and directly linking it to our ancestral lineages, to those voices, those countless generations of beings that preceded us, whose yearnings had not been actualized, whose questions had not been answered, whose essence had not been recognized. And we are on that wave, and moving of life waking up to itself through humanity.
and in some sense, the ancestors are looking at us, waiting for us to get it done.
This is what people report. And it's been fascinating in this in-depth work. At times people discover an ancestral lineage, of suffering, almost always. And as they resolve a particular issue within themselves, it feels like that whole lineage lights up for them in some way. It's very interesting. It's very
And
interesting.
how do you understand that, John?
That is, I can understand it in two ways. I can understand it as we carry a kind of psychic traces from our ancestors that are passed on culturally and through specific families of origin. So in a kind of linear way, it's our baggage, and the baggage becomes illumined, So that would be a more conventional way. Another way, which is much more kind of mind-blowing, is it's all happening at the same time, that our concept of linearity is just that, a concept. And so past, present, future are all coexisting simultaneously, and a change in any of those affects all of them.
Yeah. Okay.
But
I've understood that at brief moments. I've seen that.
but I honestly, I can't say that that's my lived experience. That's a concept. That's a concept. But it is interesting that people have these experiences where it feels like the ancestors are grateful for the unfolding that someone is discovering, a letting go of some deep confusion.
Yeah. You point to the way that Jung and Ramana Maharshi, well, a couple of questions here. First, followed different paths. They had different callings, and they responded to what life asked of each of them. And you pointed to the fact that Jung focused on mental contents, even though very profound ones, whereas Ramana Maharshi went to the dropped into and became the awareness in which content arises.
Yes.
Would you say that is those are characteristic of Indian culture and contemporary Western culture, respectively?
I think so. I mean, with exceptions, of course. But yeah, India in particular, excuse me, has a transcendent accent to its spirituality. And Western culture, I mean, you can see, if we look at Meister Eckhart, for instance, there's a transcendent aspect, but he was very interested in living that the Geburts, the birth of spirit in ordinary life as well. So he's an outlier, I think. There are a few outliers in Western society, but mainly we've been interested in the content. And really, prior to Jung, there wasn't a clear articulation, of even this subtle archetypal level. There was certainly expressions of it, but not, a conceptual framework with which to understand it. But yeah, I think, we in the West are more concerned with form, and in India, in its more transcendent traditions, with the formless.
I had a friend recently tell me when I was struggling, going through kind of a dark period, he told me, and this has really stuck with me, that the content is the path. So I was like, huh, okay. And I guess that's form is emptiness, and emptiness is form, sort of thing. But we're talking about, I guess, different yogas kind of leading us to the same, eventually the same place. I don't know. That's just a concept, but what would you say about that?
Well, I think, again, Jung was concerned with individuation,
Yeah.
and the individualized expression of essential, of these archetypal qualities. So I think they lead to complementary but differentiated places, and I think both are important, actually. And I think the tendency is to devalue one or the other. And I see them. This has been my discovery, that the openness, that discovering really the depths of true nature, this unbounded, open, undefined awareness, I find actually supports the actualization and individuation process, because we're less, as we engage in it more deeply, we're less concerned about our image and story, because we realize it's not who we are fundamentally. So the less we are concerned with how am I doing, how do I look, my legacy, what am I going to achieve, and we're more and more in the process of just life living itself, those gifts come forward in a very much more spontaneous and unpretentious way. And so my experience is like opening to unbounded awareness supports the individuation process when properly understood. But people get stuck on the spiritual path, and they often get stuck in the transcendent, and they get stuck up here. They get stuck in like this awareness, which feels, expansive, which feels free. But there's this whole kind of embodiment, the descent, really to include the body is the discovery that emptiness is form and form is emptiness. The non-separation of form and formless, that it's all consciousness. Not just as a nice thought, but as a lived reality. That's the immanent approach, and I think that blends these dimensions that we're talking about.
And John, you, in your use of Ramana Maharshi and Carl Jung as exemplars of people who followed their calling to distinctly different realizations and discoveries about the psyche and about human nature, but in ways which you're pointing out can be used in very complementary ways. And then you brought it back to the reader, and you ask a beautiful question. Given that these two are exemplars of following their calling, what is life asking of you? I thought that was such a beautiful question.
That's good.
Yeah. It's a living question. It's a question that is, and it's not a question for ordinary mind, right? Not a question for thought, ordinary conceptual thought. It's a question that takes us into our depths, into openness, into an innocent availability, and a deep listening, and trusting. Coming back to your point, Roger, that there is something profoundly trustworthy in the core of our being that both supports us and nourishes us and provides meaningful direction as well. So
Yeah,
a living question.
yeah, it's a beautiful reflection. And you towards the end of your book, Your Deepest Ground, you come to the deepest ground, the groundless ground. And You've been alluding to this at several points in our discussion, but is there anything else you'd like to say about this groundless ground as you describe it?
Well, here's the difficulty. That's putting any words to that which is prior to words,
Yeah.
putting any images to that which is prior to imagery. I will say this. Usually when there's the first encounter with it is an encounter with darkness, with silence, with stillness, with a sense of emptiness, and the sense of no thing or no thingness. And let's say we have gone through our fear of being nothing and no one, our fear of annihilation, and there is an openness to this. It has that quality of profound stillness and silence and darkness, not referring to anyone or anything. Even the sense I am is too much. As we surrender to, relax into, trust this no thingness, very often there's a sense of pure potentiality too. It's like no form, no one, no thing, and yet a sense of inherent fullness as potentiality. In other words, the darkness is brimming with light, it's pregnant with creativity. And as there's a just growing trust and sensitivity of this, there is a natural movement of that luminosity in potential into form. And we can feel it as an upwelling current of life. Not that it happens in such a linear or hierarchical way, because it can happen at any point. We can have glimpses of this before and openings and closings. But the more we are at ease and grounded in this openness, and that's the paradoxical, here's language is so paradoxical, in the darkness, in the stillness, in the silence, in the no-thingness, the more there is just a natural relaxation, recognition of this as true, as source, the more we are open to an essential life moving through us. And it feels like the word source has its root in French, source, spring. It has a spring-like quality, an upwelling creative energy that begins to move through us. And we can, if we're sensitive, we can feel that. And we can feel it as a kind of inner light, inner luminosity, inner aliveness that begins to move through us. And its natural movement is up and out, an outpouring, an upwelling and an outpouring. So some people feel this, some people don't. It's not necessary to feel it. It can be, I have found a wide range of sensitivity to this process. And as I suggested earlier, what initially feels like a downward opening into like just infinite darkness and stillness below becomes more global. It's like 360. It's non-directional, right? And it also has the qualities of the other portals, quality of love, quality of just brilliant clarity, diamond-like clarity as well.
Yeah. And you have a beautiful sentence there. You say, the truth of who we are is an inexpressible openness.
Mm.
Yeah, I just love that statement. Yeah. Uh, so there's another aspect of your work that isn't such a central part of your book, Your Deepest Ground. It's implied, but it's something which you seem to have stepped into more, and that is a bringing of these profound perspectives. Your work is sometimes described as non-dual. You're sometimes described as a non-dual teacher. But of late, you have been bringing this perspective to bear on the great issues of our time and speaking to the ways in which these profound recognitions and understandings of who we are and who we can recognize ourselves to be can inform and inspire uh, social activism and working with the great issues that we face. I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm,
This
please.
is, yeah, this is an emergent aspect, and it's been implicit, I think, and I've always been kind of engaged politically and interested what's going on in a relative level. Although my primary focus has been on kind of inner healing and awakening. So it feels like a response to the times in a way. It's like there is, given how precious this understanding is, how deep, how profound, how light transformative, the question is then how does this wish to move in the world now in response? What would an engaged non-duality or non-dual orientation or approach begin to look like? And one of the reasons I think that this has been, there are a number of reasons I imagine why this hasn't been articulated so far. One is that non-dual teachings have been historically more transcendent, more and more concerned with individual liberation. And this is true in Advaita, but also in other non-dual teachings within Buddhist traditions and other contemplative traditions. But the essential recognition of non-separateness or oneness, that self and other, the distinction between, there are differences, but there are distinctions, but not a fundamental difference, is really where this comes from, because we're so much of conflict is around us and them, around our egocentric perspective. And as collective, we have identities as groups and we have identities as individuals, but they're always separative. There's always an us and a them. And therefore we're fighting, from one perspective to another. And it feels to me that even though it's a relatively small community of deep contemplatives who are in the process of recognizing this deeper truth, it is an essential one to bring into ordinary life and particularly to the pressing issues. And the issue that's been most pressing for me has been climate change and climate disruption, because we are facing an existential crisis that we have never faced as humanity before, and it's one that we've caused ourselves. And it is deeply, our economics, our system of governance is deeply rooted in this egocentric perspective. And therefore, to come from a different perspective, to introduce this clarity and understanding in a way that feels authentic to us into whatever roles we're given. If we have a role in leadership in government or business, if we're in a teaching role, if we're writing, if we have podcasts, if we have conversations with friends and family, if we're organizing groups that have kindred spirits, contemplatives to take action from this awareness, I think this is a very important contribution to make. I don't think it's the only one. I don't think it's sufficient in itself. Like, I think we need our scientists. We need our, all hands on deck, really. All resources, our best minds, our best hearts, to engage and to do so collectively, because individually it's not enough. There's this idea, this came up in the non-dual roundtable, the frequency holders, and something is an idea apparently introduced by Eckhart Tolle, that it's enough just to radiate consciousness. And I would say perhaps that's true for a few individuals like Ramana Maharshi, but I think for most of us, we can be frequency holders, but also frequency actors. We can act from this deeper, more inclusive, less separative awareness, and not only radiating that into the field of consciousness, the shared field, which has its value, but also acting from that. Now, the interesting challenge is it's going to look different for different people. There are always going to be conservatives. There's always going to be progressives, and so it's not taking a particular point of view. It's actually the willingness to step back and entertain many perspectives and many views, and to hold one's own view lightly and still act in a way from compassion and from a deep understanding. So it's more an invitation to contemplative communities with a non-dual orientation to ask the question, what is a natural response to this threat, genuine existential threat? Because, as beings that are interdependent with all of life and the biosphere, if this experiment fails, there's not going to be any wisdom tradition around, not on this planet. So that's a brief overview of how this has been moving. And so I've been doing some teaching in person and online, and building a community around engaged non-duality, and hopefully this process will continue with others as well, inviting other non-dual teachers to engage in that.
Yeah, and thank you very much. This is clearly one of the great issues and questions of our time is how do we bring whatever capacities we have, and in this particular case, how do we bring any understanding, psychological, spiritual, we have gained to both act from, as you're saying, act from a hopefully a little wiser, a little more gentler and appreciative stance. And how do we allow ourselves to be used as optimal instruments of service?
Exactly. And that's a willingness to kind of come out. It's a coming out process. It's one thing, it's very interesting to have worked with people for so long and to see the hesitancy that people feel to bring out the light of awareness, because it's so sacred, it's so precious, it's carefully guarded, and very often early on we decide that it's not welcome or safe to bring that into the world. And so the awakening, the opening very often, and opening of the heart and opening of the ground very often involves going through this fear and inhibition to really come out in the full luminosity of our core being. And this is like bringing it out further, bringing it out into the sphere of political action. And how can we move not from fear, but from love, not from limited understanding, but from a deeper wisdom, a transrational wisdom. So, I don't see it as a mass movement, because most people aren't that interested or motivated to go to these kind of depths of exploration. And why some people do and some people don't is a complete mystery. But for those of us who do, those of us who are deep contemplatives, who also care deeply about the planet and about our fellow human beings and fellow beings of all kinds, it means opening a heart to collective suffering. That's another reason why these traditions have kind of kept a distance. It's like, if we're opening to suffering, not getting lost in it, not fixating on it, feeling the grief, feeling the loss, feeling the despair, and feeling what's behind that too. and to sense there is a greater love and a greater presence here available as a resource for all of us. Like one of the things that happens with activists is they get burned out very, very quickly, and just given the scope of resistance and the difficulty of the issues that they're working at. So one specific way that those of us who are deep contemplatives can help is to help resource others who are, out and very active. But we can be activists ourselves as well. And it's about finding what form that's true for us, and finding others, because it has to be, we have to affiliate. I think we have to, there's strength in numbers as well. So it's where it's coming from. And I mean, we were just talking at the beginning of the program about the recent election 2 days ago, and how to respond, and feeling it, many people feeling disheartened and shocked and despairing. And these are very understandable responses. What's important is that we really get quiet, dig deep, find that depth of heart and depth of ground, and respond from there, to not be discouraged by lies, deception, by the appeals to basic instincts of fear and anger, but rather than getting lost in that, to actually go deeper and come from a deeper and truer place. And I think maybe, maybe just here and there, or maybe councils of wise beings coming together and assisting various organizations could be one form that might take.
Yeah, there's a deep cult-like spell that many people in our country are caught up in, where and I've experienced this personally, if you even suggest that humans have any responsibility about what's going on in the world and the weather and nature and all that, they get very angry.
We don't like to have our worldview challenged, right? And there's an art to doing that, and there's an art to being with someone who has a very different perspective and from ours, and being able to actually see through that and feel through that to what is not separate and what is shared, and to stay in touch with that, like heart to heart. That's very precious and important.
Yeah, and a practice of itself.
It is, very much so.
Yeah. Beautiful. John, we've covered a lot here, and you've covered a lot in this beautiful book, Your Deepest Ground. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I'm grateful. I'm grateful to be here. I'm just grateful in general. As you know, I'm grateful to be alive and have this experience, this mystery of life. So there's that. But grateful to be able to have this conversation with you, and grateful for the work that both of you do in your podcasts. And as far as the theme of the deep ground, I think I come back to the theme of our love of truth. And truth not as an ideology, not as a dogma, not as a particular perspective, but the truth of being, the truth of awareness that we all share. And our love for that will bring us to the depths of our heart and the depths of our ground. Our love for that comes from those. Comes from that. So like we're following the love, our devotion to what is most precious and what is most important, and to let that be our guide. Yeah, I think that's what's important, and to be willing to feel anything, experience anything, see anything, know anything, in this process of giving ourselves to an unfolding, unfathomable truth of who we really are.
Beautiful. Thank you, John. And thank you for this exquisite book, Your Deepest Ground.
Yeah. You're very welcome.
Yeah, and your beautiful sharing right now. It's very, very moving. And thank you very much.
Yeah, I genuinely enjoyed being with both of you.